Welcome to our show. This is going to be terrible. We're three friends hanging out, doing whatever seems interesting at the time. Don't say we didn't warn you. If you're joining us for the first time, welcome. My name is Robert.
Hey, I'm James.
And I'm Nathan. In our first terrible game review, we venture to explore whether or not this title from developer Asmodee and Steve Jackson Games achieves glorious victory in summoning sought-after nostalgia from our Munchkin card game-playing past. Will it bring us hordes of 3,872 orcs of entertainment? Or will we find ourselves with a chicken on our heads and be subject to -1 on all of our dice rolls? All of our dice rolls, Robert.
It depends on how you define the word all, Nathan. Do you mean all, or do you mean all?
Before we begin, a little information about the game. For today's show, we reviewed Munchkin Quacked, based on the popular card game series Munchkin by Steve Jackson Games. Quacked Quest was developed and published by Asmodee in November of 2019 and can be played on all major consoles and PC. It is categorized as an indie action casual RPG with solo and local multiplayer and cooperation modes supporting up to 4 players. Asmodee has a clip that briefly sums up the game quite nicely and in Munchkin style to boot. We've left a link in the description so you can watch it on your own time.
I don't know about you guys, but the thought of a Munchkin video game had me pretty excited.
It seems like an overly ambitious attempt at digitizing the card game, so that can either be pretty good or pretty not good. Seen as the original Munchkin card game came out in the early noughties before online multiplayer was a standard in console gaming, I can't imagine the creators had any sort of intent to make a system that could someday be expanded into that format. I was a fan of the game the moment I first laid my eyes on it. The art style, the humor, being able to play cooperatively or as a free-for-all, all without having to reset the entire game or change any rules, just, I'll help you this turn, but next turn you will perish. With my limited funds in high school, I knew I had to have this game. And it was pleasantly surprised when they kept coming out with expansions and spin-offs to their classic formula. The fact that you can even mix all the different themes together to make an even zanier version of the classic just speaks volumes to the simplicity of the design, but the depth of playability that every individual card can bring to the game.
So I'm 99% sure that the first time I played the original Munchkin card game would have been back with Nathan in high school. So I have just some distinct memories of pushing single occupant desks together to try and make enough space for playing the game. All during free time after schoolwork was finished, of course. Yes. The game was simple yet addictive enough that we got quite a few people into the game, so it made for a lot of fun times. Seeing as the game was originally released back in 2001, it would have seemed like there should have been an official digital version of the game by now. So upon hearing that Quacked Quest would not be that, let's just say I did not go into this game with high expectations.
I was introduced to the game Munchkin by Nathan and James during one of our mini game nights in our college days. I still actually own the base game Munchkin Deluxe. You might actually see some boxes here on my desk. I also own quite a few of the expansions of the base game, but none of the spin-off expansions like Munchkin Zombies or Munchkin Cthulhu, and there are a ton of them. The card game is fantastic and lots of fun, except for the fact that James always seems to win.
Do not hate the player, hate the game. I seem to recall you'd usually antagonize other players to gang up on you, but enough about that.
Before we share our thoughts, let's break down how the game works. Players spawn in the Dungeonarium, a lobby of sorts where you and your friends gather and prepare for the ensuing mayhem. In the Dungeonarium, you select your race, your hat, if you want one. It has no effect on the game at all, and the amount of time you want the dungeon clearing portion of the game to last. You can also study up on what each card included in the game does, which are broken into 3 categories. Dungeon cards determine how the enemies, combat, dungeon layout, and bosses are selected. Loot cards tell you about the sort of loot that can be dropped during the game. And lastly, monster cards work just like the loot cards, but for the monsters. Not all cards are available when you first start up the game. At the end of each playthrough, you're presented with 2 cards and can only choose one to unlock. The unlocked card then becomes available for use.
I think it's important to point out this is the only time you actually get to pick a card, and it only serves to unlock that particular thing for future playthroughs. If it's a dungeon card, that modifier is now a possible outcome for random dungeon generators. If it's a loot card, that loot is now possible loot drop for your game. And if it's a monster card, that monster is now a possible foe for you to kill in any future playthrough.
The last thing you can do in the Dungeonarium is select whether or not to play with bots. If you're playing alone, bots are not optional for the game as it requires at least 2 players to start. But once you have the minimum number of participants, the game can begin.
You're then presented with 4 randomly selected dungeon cards, one from each of 4 subcategories. A modifier, which does things like add more enemies, or make enemies move faster, or increase enemy damage. A combat flavor, which determines the type of enemies you'll face, like tougher enemies or ranged enemies. A layout flavor, which influences the randomly generated dungeon formation, usually like more pits or more traps. And lastly, the boss card. That determines the boss you'll fight, and after the playtime expires, and the objective for defeating it. And there are one of 3 possibilities in those objectives. Get the last hit when it dies, deal the most damage when it dies, or take the least amount of damage when it dies.
Now that the dungeon cards are selected, you enter the randomly generated dungeon to complete randomly selected tasks to unlock the next room. The tasks could be things like grab the most ducks, kill all the enemies, or throw all the enemies into the pits. Once the objective is complete, the player who completes the task first or is the most munchkinly in that objective goes up a level, and the players can then kick down the door to the next room. You'll do this repeatedly, either to your enjoyment or disgust, until the amount of time selected runs out. At the end of the time, you're all thrown into the final room to face the boss and complete the objective that was chosen. Whew. I think we covered everything, right guys? It's about as typical as it gets for a dungeon clearing game, but knowing how the game is played should help explain our thoughts while we now review Munchkin Quacked Quest. We'll break our review up into 5 categories. First, how the game utilizes the elements of the original card game. Next, how the game plays and looks. The solo gameplay experience, then the multiplayer experience, and finally, how replayable is it? We'll also share things we thought were great or terrible that might not fit in those categories, and end with our summary and judgment. So first off, let's kick how the game utilizes the elements of the original card game.
Nathan was right. Turning a card game into a video game that isn't strictly just a digitized version of the physical game was most likely not in the cards when Steve Jackson originally imagined how players would continue to expand on it. But I think Quack Quest did this well enough. We described earlier how the cards in this case act as modifiers for the various gameplay elements. Enemies, weapons, objectives are all slightly tweaked by the cards. But I would have liked to see more cards. By my count, there's only 90, and monster cards are only 15 of those. I would have also liked to see players be able to select cards to be able to modify dungeons on their own, create their own dungeon variants, or maybe even select skills and weapons before they start the matches instead of depending on that during loot drops.
I would have liked to see more fine-tuning in the dungeon generation. Maybe after so many playthroughs, they allow you to turn off certain rooms or even scenarios, or at least keep them from being chosen at random from the layout card pool. However, I would argue that for a dungeon crawling game, this adapted to the source's material fairly well, including the races and classes, adding ducks to the dungeon. It definitely felt like a Munchkin-inspired video game.
I personally like the structure of the original card game much more than I like this poor attempt at a hybrid dungeon crawler party game. In the card game, each player has their own separate turns in which they can go through the dungeon and fight the monsters, with the other players playing cards from their hands to help or hinder the turn player. It's a kind of organized chaos that, to me, works. It allows you to have some form of planning and strategy. Quacked Quest, on the other hand, has everyone going at it as a free-for-all, which, while it makes sense for that type of a party game, it just felt like a little bit too much chaos for me and not enough like the actual card game of Munchkin.
So how about the game itself now, without looking at how it compares to the original card game?
Sure. Let me start with the controls. Since the game isn't overly complicated, you've got your basic controls, which covers pretty much everything you need. The only thing I didn't like is the controls when you want to sell loot. You have to hold the A and X buttons at the same time. And, since the X is the primary attack button, I had issues where it would not register holding both. It would just register the X and then do a charge attack instead of selling. And since time is of the essence and everybody's vying for every advantage they can get, that extra second can cost you the round.
So according to a developer of the game who did an AMA on Reddit, we'll be sure to include a link to it in our notes for the episode. The lead platform that they focused on when developing the game was the Nintendo Switch. So some of that wonkiness in the controls might be explained away by having a lack of button inputs available on the Switch Joy-Con controller when you compare it to the number of inputs on an Xbox One controller. And since we played on Xbox One primarily, that's what we're going on. Still, when you have to hold down the buttons for every single confirmation in the game, it can be very annoying. Anytime you need to go to a new menu or confirm anything, you have to hold down the button for around 3 seconds. Just really wish they would have shortened that a bit.
For the visuals, they're about as standard as it gets for an indie title, which I like most here is that they stuck true to the Munchkin art style, which I think was more important to me than making anything that was visually striking. My only gripe would be that when things on the screen start to get busy, it's hard to make out what's going on. You can't see your character or any of the loot. It does add to the mayhem, so I can give them a pass.
To me, the visuals are just fine. Personally, I would have preferred a more cel-shaded approach, which would have had it looking similar to the actual art of the card game. What disappoints me the most about this art is that the camera is so far zoomed out during the gameplay that you can't really focus on any of the details, and they're just lost in all the chaos going on.
The only gameplay element that I want to note here, though, is literally the worst thing they could have stolen from Mario Party, and that's the random level awards that they give you at the end of every session. The game awards players for completing random objectives for selected categories, like mostly most of stuff. Who kicked the door most, who tackled the most, who collected the most gold, are just some of the ones that I experienced. The problem I have with this is twofold. The first is that if you spent time winning all the objectives and someone just kind of, did the bare minimum and did just enough to kind of stay close behind you, they could win enough potentially random categories that they could end up closing the gap or even overtake you. The other problem I have with this is that you can game the system. If you know the categories well enough, you can continue to do those things throughout the game to make sure that you win those. And I was able to do this to great effect. I took some of the categories that I knew existed in the game after doing a couple playthroughs and just made sure to keep doing those things like crazy, and nobody came close to my numbers, and I would win the game by leaps and bounds. I get that this may be something that would happen in Munchkin, the card game. You could have the game locked, and then someone who sat back and just stayed off the radar could sweep the game right from under you. This is only fun when it's intentional, not random.
That's kind of like playing Cleric in the original card game to hopefully get Divine Intervention played when you're at level 9, leveling up to 10 to win the game. It is a bit random, but I think that's the purpose. Know how the game works, then exploit it. I get that randomness can tip a game to being unfair, but to me that's been the point of Munchkin. Who can play the game, who can play the players, and who can play the system. And I think those little bonuses awarded at the end of the match is a way for them to add that element of the original card game into this video game. I do agree with everything else Robert said. The controls don't need to be overly complicated and aren't, but could use some fine-tuning. Also, the game looks like a Munchkin game, and that pleases me greatly.
I'll admit, party games like this are not my cup of tea. Like I said earlier, there's a lot of chaos in the gameplay, and when you're winning by a line slide, hey, great, that might be fun for you, but everybody else is not going to be having a good time, and it just sucks. I don't mind playing a game like this every once in a while with friends, getting together, having some fun, but considering this game has no online multiplayer whatsoever, it's definitely not happening in a local space.
So how does this game play as just a solo experience?
Playing the solo game is all right, I guess. I can't find myself playing it, though, more than a single playthrough, as the bots can be a bit of annoying. When objective is complete, I kind of want to move around the room and grab some loot and see what else I can do to improve my character, but they just want to run for the door. And I get that this can happen when you're playing with friends, but, maybe your friends also want to collect loot, and so there's a greater chance. The bots just always make a beeline straight for the door. Speaking of the bots, though, I think they're pretty good. They're competitive enough to where I didn't feel like I was winning every objective easily, but they weren't too hard that it felt like I was just playing a losing battle. They provided what I think is a comparable experience to playing with people of the same skill set, just without all of the added fun of banter.
I honestly did not play it as a solo player. It kind of felt cheating to do so with the Munchkin game, but it's still a mostly necessary function for a video game. The only way to have gotten around that would be set up with game servers and lobbies, but I don't think they had the budget or intent to make the game more than a one-computer experience. They might have also included adventure mode as completely solo, and depending on how long you can survive determines how many cards you can unlock. If you last less than 5 minutes, you don't get any cards. If you're able to make it up to 10 minutes, 1 card, and so on. That way, playing with friends is a guaranteed way to unlock cards, and learning how to play well could unlock them faster.
Yeah, solo is not worth it at all. The inclusion of the bots is a nice touch, but this is the type of game made to be played in multiplayer. Do not buy this game if you have no one else to play it with. It is just not worth it for the solo gameplay.
Okay, so what if we do have friends to play it with?
Nathan, the game completely fails here. There's essentially no online multiplayer with the exception of Steam Remote Play Together, which I would argue is just too complicated to set up and isn't a true online multiplayer experience. Nathan, you and I spent a good 20 minutes just trying to figure out the controls for that thing. It's just no good. There is local multiplayer, but it's 2020. That's pretty much useless. I understand the game came out in November 2019 when COVID-19 was just a glimmer in a bat's eye. But come on, even if we're in a pandemic right now, you still wouldn't be able to play with friends that are in other parts of the world.
Yeah, for a video game based off a card game that is essentially only multiplayer, they definitely dropped the ball here.
Oh, for sure. Not having online multiplayer is a big missed opportunity. To me, honestly, it means I don't even intend on revisiting this game again unless they patch it in later. And realistically, probably not even then.
Okay, if they do make some changes, how would it feel to replay this game?
This is another area of concern for me. After a round or two, the game kind of gets repetitive in a tedious way. So I kind of find myself needing to put it down for a few hours, sometimes even a few days before I'm even really kind of in the mood to play again. Since there's no online multiplayer that really would have helped. I mean, where is it, guys? Having friends and being able to banter or straight up yell at each other makes the game just that much more fun. So the replayability sucks here.
I do have to give the props for making an attempt at replayability, even if it is grindy. So many times I've played games where I clear the story, get all the side quests done, collect the collectibles, achieve the achievables, and then I never pick up the game again, mostly because the story was also meh. While it's not a unique or revolutionary replayability function, I still at least appreciate the effort.
Once the grind to unlock all the cards is finished, all you have left is revisiting the same dungeon rooms over and over and over again. This is made worse by the fact that there are so few different dungeon room layouts. You'll be seeing them far too often. When combined with the fact that there's only those handful of few different objectives, collecting the ducks, getting the duck first, beating people up, things just get very boring very quickly.
That's a lot of terrible things about this game. Is there anything good we can say about it?
Nothing great stood out to me, man. Everything felt basic. Good enough, just not great.
I think the best joke in the entire game has been its price point of $25.
The only great thing in this game, honestly, is when you uninstall it to never play it again. Enough said.
Okay, any other terrible things we can think to poke at this thing?
I do have one. I do. One of the things that makes Munchkin the card game great is the humor. The card titles and visuals aren't just funny in their own right, but the descriptions and the actions that they have you do are chuckle-worthy, if not downright hilarious. Since during the game, the action is constantly ongoing, they try to kind of bridge this gap by using the game's announcer. I think his name is Spike. The problem here is that the jokes that Spike tells fall flat, and after a few minutes, they just get repetitive. When you're playing the game, you tend to die a lot. And there are only about 2 or 3 things that Spike says when you die, or jokes he tells when you die. And since there are 4 of you, and you die a lot, and sometimes back to back over and over and over again, you're just hearing the same 2 or 3 death jokes ad nauseum during that round. So again, since there's no online multiplayer, you can only rely on the game to provide the humor, and it just simply doesn't.
I still can't believe they missed the best joke from the entirety of the original Munchkin card game, where in the rules it states, you start the game as a level 1 human with no class. Are you really telling me there is no way to work that gym in?
So a couple of the few things that didn't quite make the list earlier. The first time when you're dropped into the game lobby, the main dungeonarium place, you are given absolutely no direction, no instruction of what you're supposed to do. That's just poor game design. You kind of have to hope you go to the right areas. Come on, guys. The clock in the game where you determine how long you're going to play before you fight the final boss, it does not work properly. You go and hit it, you want to try to choose a time, it just gives you a random number. It sucks. This game is bad, everybody.
So after all that, what's our final thoughts? What's our judgment?
For me, the game is okay. It isn't great, but it also doesn't reach terrible status for me. I think it's fun enough to play alone, but it won't keep your attention for too long. When it starts to get repetitive and Spike's jokes just get tiring after the 100 repeat. The game needed three things for me to be worth its $25 price tag: online multiplayer, more cards, and the ability to create your own dungeon possibilities by selecting your own dungeon cards. So while the game isn't terrible, I don't think I'll find myself playing it much after this review. Thank goodness it was included in Xbox Game Pass. Otherwise, I'd have to pay $25 for it, and it might have landed definitely in the terrible category for me. Asmodee, if you're listening, please just add those three things or drop the price to $10. I could live with those without those if the price was around that point.
No, this game is terrible. Even as much as I've enjoyed the Munchkin brand of games, I refuse to believe that Steve Jackson Games allowed the rights for a video game of their flagship material to be made with this quality and then charge $25 for it. It's a slap in the face to their fan base and probably has ruined any further headway of Steve Jackson Games, much less Munchkin Games, into the digital space. If they didn't make those changes, it would not be enough to reverse the damage this atrocity has made.
The game is just flat out terrible, everyone. Full stop. Honestly, even if they patched in online multiplayer, I don't think it'd be worth the purchase price, let alone the time to download it or the precious hard drive space that I have so few of. I don't know why the developers thought this light dungeon crawler party game hybrid thing is what fans of the original card game would want, as opposed to an official digital version of the game. If they would just give us that, everyone would be happy and maybe we can move on to something more important like, I don't know, world peace or something. It's just a thought.
Well, that wraps up our review of Munchkin Quacked Quest. The game is available on all major consoles and on PC through Steam. It does cost $25 on its own, and it's hardly worth the price of admission based on our review. But if you own an Xbox and are a subscriber of Xbox Game Pass, it's currently included for free. The PC version is also included if you are a subscriber to Xbox Game Pass Ultimate, though for this review, we all played it on Xbox. We don't expect there is much of a difference between platforms other than slight variations of button layouts.
If you do own the game or get a chance to play it for yourself, let us know what you think. If you're watching this on YouTube, share your thoughts in the comments. If you're listening to this on a podcast platform, you can drop us a line with your take on our website at thisisgoingtobeterrible.show or on Facebook by searching for This Is Going to Be Terrible Podcast. Catch you on the next one.
Later.
Be good to each other out there.